A very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to our April supply chain update, part of our ongoing weekly live stream series. I'm Christopher Ludwig, editor-in-chief at Automotive for Ultimo Media, and it's once again, it's becoming the highlight of my week, I have to say, to get a chance to share some time with all of you here. This is a very special edition of our live stream series. We started with our March update, where we brought you data and insight in this forum, and we've been obviously running it ever since in a number of different themes. And this week we're kind of returning to take another step back, kind of see where we are, and we've got some really fantastic presenters here today to give you some more detail. So let me tell you a little bit about what we have in store for you. We have our special guest today. We're going to be very pleased to hear from Matteo Fini, who's the Executive Director of Automotive Supply Chain and Technology at IH Markit. He's going to give us a lot of insight on what's happening on manufacturing and supplier disruption and some of the regulatory aspects. And we're also very pleased afterwards, we'll hear from Fathi Tlatli, who's the President of Global Sector Automobility for DHL Customer Solutions, who will give us a lot more insight on what's really happening in the logistic networks right now. Before we do that, I'm going to give you, as we sort of, as is part of our kind of tradition here, I'll give you some global updates about what's going on around the world, about where we are in the supply chain and what we can kind of expect out of that. If I can just start with another poll, however, though I like kicking these things off to get your view. We've got a lot of people in the room, a lot of experts in the industry, and what you think really matters to us. So let's start with the poll. Now that we're getting into more production, especially in Europe, and we're seeing the plans in other parts of the regions, I'd like to kind of get your sense for where you think the disruption might continue most in what regions over the next couple of months. Do you see it the most disruption coming in Europe, in North America, South America, China and East Asia, India and Southeast Asia? So if you can let us know what you think, so I can see the votes are pouring in now. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll because it looks to me like no one else is going to catch up. And I'm sorry for our North American and American friends, but the audience is pretty sure that the disruption will continue to the highest degree in North America, which is quite an interesting output there. I'm going to leave it to talk a little bit more of that with some of our panelists, because I think that you know, there's a lot of interesting developments happening in that. Okay, so kind of on that basis, where are we? Again, a quick couple of slides here just to sort of bring us up to speed. As where you know, China is well back into production and industrial economic ramp up. Sources at Volkswagen that I spoke to this week, you know, I've confirmed that that's about 70% of levels back to pre-crisis levels. They're expecting to come back to or even surpass pre-crisis by around early summer. China is increasingly the template for other industries here, other sectors as we go forward, in terms of temperature testing, in terms of masks, social distancing, and other processes put in place. And we'll talk a little. We're going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. China has also become a key source in the supply chain for PPE equipment. Reports that Volkswagen is even making its own masks and importing them from Tianjin into Europe. But as much as their activity is picking up, I think it's very much worth pointing out that China is still subject to global supply shortages, and you know, could be subject to issues from Europe and other regions. But the supply chain certainly is proving to be robust so far. Moving on from China. Okay, in Europe, as we talked about, as we've been talking about, we've moved deeper into restart here, and I think I won't dwell on the details here because you can see them. and most of you know what's happening in the news in general. But Volkswagen, the big increase now this week with Zwickau going online, followed by its main plant in Wolfsburg. We've also seen some restarts from Renault and Mercedes-Benz set this week as well. A number of others across Europe too. So this is all typically a single shift in most cases. Volkswagen starting back in Wolfsburg around 10-15% with plans to move that back up to 40%. And it's a similar kind of upscaling across manufacturing, leaving plenty of room to introduce those longer takt times, more safety equipment and other processes. But they're very dependent on supply availability and clearly on demand, which we'll talk about. But some dealers starting to open more in Germany. We still have plenty of issues on ports and warehouses. In the US, where many of you think the issues are likely to persist to the greatest point, we've got a few stirrings of life. Mercedes-Benz, the first to go in Alabama, and it looks like other southern states will take a lead there based on initial plans. There's a bit of uncertainty in terms of Michigan, in terms of when some of the unions in UAW and in Canada will allow restart, but that is broadly speaking expected in middle of May. Mexico is also now allowing plants to reopen that had been federally mandated to be shut. They are allowed to reopen, but we note a lot of caution from the OEM side in doing that. Cross-border supply chain there, still a big risk if we're looking for North American restart. Perhaps that was partly of what some of you fear for disruptions to come. Around the world, we have a host of different issues, from no lockdown in Korea, which is probably more impacted by demand than by actual issues there, whereas Japan is largely shut. India and Brazil facing a lot of disruption. Other regions to open slowly following Europe, but largely could be dependent on a third wave in the developing world. So that's just a little short kind of quick global roundup from my side. Again, I'm sorry about some of the background noise interference that we're getting there. We'll try and sort that out as quickly as possible. But it's now my pleasure to bring on to our panel Matteo Fini from IHS Markit at the Automotive Supply Chain Division. Hi, Matteo, can you see me?
Hi, Christopher. How are you?
Fantastic to have you here. Thanks again. So I'm going to hand the reins over to Matteo, because I know you've got a lot of interesting data and insight to share for us. When you're ready, we'll kick off there. So thanks again, Matteo.
Great. Thanks, Christopher, for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I thought today I will give you a flavor of some of the analysis that we have conducted specifically in my team within IHS Markit, which is called Supply Chain and Technology. So specifically, I look after a team of analysts that produce forecast analytics around supply chain and technology, as the word suggests, at a pretty granular level. So effectively, for any vehicle rolling off manufacturing plant between now and the next 6 to 12 years, we will identify all the specifications, 300 plus specifications, and as well as who is making the different parts. And it goes without saying that COVID-19 has thrown a few more than a spanner in the works, I should say, when it comes to supply chain. We've seen, of course, unprecedented levels of disruption, which began, I would say, only a few days after the Wuhan lockdown back on the 23rd of January. And of course, since then, we have really seen two leitmotifs, I would say. First one being asymmetry of demand, asymmetry in the supply of parts, in the supply of vehicles, and so on. And on the other hand, also, we have seen different exposure, because that level of asymmetry has materialized at different times in the different regions across the world. So over the last 13 weeks, we have had a situation whereby we started first with Chinese supply chain, as Christopher was mentioning before, struggling really to satisfy demand in other parts of the world. So effectively, you had a situation whereby several OEMs were scrambling to secure alternative supplies from that Chinese sourced parts. And then we moved into a situation whereby we're actually, it's kind of the flip side of where we were discussing only a few weeks ago, where essentially Chinese OEMs seem concerned about the availability of parts that they would have typically sourced from Europe and the US. So today I wanted just to quickly show you, to focus on some very specific aspects that I believe are relevant to this audience. First, starting with government measures. As I said, it's really a case of asymmetry, and so we thought, we would try to quantify a bit the level of disruption that COVID-19 is bringing onto automotive manufacturing. Secondly, focusing on launches delays and what that means not just to the OEMs but also to suppliers, and then finally touching also on a topic of regulatory environment that will have quite a few implications in everything in terms of automotive manufacturing as well as supply of vehicles into the different markets. So starting first with our barometer of disruption in automotive manufacturing. So we thought we would really try to gauge how stringent the government measures were in various countries around the globe, and really try to understand how this impacts OEMs and suppliers based on their exposure to a certain country. Specifically here, we've been using OEM volumes and supplier revenues based on our component forecast in order to really understand, which parts are being more disrupted, which OEMs and which suppliers are being more impacted by the stringency, effectively, of those government measures. We have leveraged some of the base research that came from Oxford University. We have enhanced it and added quite a few more dimensions, which really made it much more into an automotive index. And specifically, we've been looking at workplace closures, which is of course a pretty direct measure of indicator of effectively automotive manufacturing operations being closed. Looking also at whether there is essentially a government mandate to close facilities, which has been the case in countries like India, like Italy and Spain, as well as school closures. So school closures is also an important measure. So yeah, so really looking at school closures as another indicator that we will consider because it has an impact also on automotive manufacturing. If you look at countries where there is not a significant amount of extended family, for example, in Europe or in North America, having schools closed immediately results in impacts on labor force availability. And this is something that we have observed, particularly in Italy and Spain, when lockdown measures were applied to local schools. Then also public transport. Some countries, of course, rely on public transport to get workers to the facilities, and we've seen specifically this was an issue in Wuhan as that province was trying to whole province was trying to reinstate production. And that happened, of course, even though theoretically the whole situation had been resolved by mid-February, we saw that actually the tail end of those issues continued for a few more weeks just because public transport was not operating. Then a pretty stringent measure, which is the internal movement restrictions. So situations whereby you basically get a government mandate not to allow movements by car, on foot, and so on. And again, we could see quite a few situations, and you just need to read the news to know that there's been issues with Chinese or Italian suppliers having issues getting access to the inventory of parts that they would have. And then finally, the international travel restriction, which is largely a people's issue, but we've noticed good correlation also with the level of disruptions and generally the level of friction that you get in goods transportation. So you can see measures like screening, quarantine, or even a ban on non-critical goods that were coming from areas where the contagion was either originated or has grown exponentially. So once we have applied essentially all of this research to the different countries, as I said, we have been then converting that into an index. And just to give you a sense, an index that goes anywhere between 0 to 20 indicates that there is a very low level of disruption. So this is typically where you get measures such as workplace screenings or quarantine from high-risk regions. So fairly non-stringent measures in the grand scheme of things. Then moving on to an index that goes anywhere between 40 to 60, which is associated with medium disruption. And that's where we have school closures at the national level. And then moving on to high disruption, where you have an index, which is pretty much where we are now, with an index anywhere between 60 to 80, and then finally up to 80 to 100, which is effectively where you get mandated government closures of automotive operations. If you look at on the chart here, you can practically see that the trend that we have observed over the last few weeks has been obviously moving upward because governments have been enforcing more and more stringent measures. And we've been moving into medium territory with the AMD index over 40, following the imposition of lockdown measures in core European countries such as France, Spain, and Italy in mid-March. Then the index rose even through mid-March up to the point where it surpassed the level of 60, which effectively tips it into medium disruption on March 24. And this, which coincides pretty much with the lockdown in India. Of course, lockdown in India has really meant that the index achieved a new high, and that's associated with the fact that effectively India produces some 5.5% of the global production in Tlatli, and on that basis, of course, it has a certain weight to the overall index calculation. So yeah, so it's been obviously going up, but up to the point where on the 14th of April we have reached the maximum so far, which was associated with an index of 66, and since then things have started easing down to an extent. Clearly, you have measures that have been watered down to an extent in countries such as South Korea, Germany, Vietnam. And this, of course, results in the index going further down. Of course, if we just connect what you see here on the screen to what Christopher was saying just before with regards to some of the return to work patterns that some of the OEMs have mentioned, you can obviously assume that by the beginning of May, we will see a further easing of measures in the various countries, which of course will result in the index also going down. Now, when we relate this to OEMs and suppliers specifically, I will say that exposure is, of course, the fundamental driver of this whole classification that you can see here on the screen. So at an OEM level, you can see that Suzuki seems more exposed to greater level of disruption due to government measures, as well as PSA. And this again, boils down to their exposure, particularly in the case of Suzuki, where you have exposure to Japan as well as India. Those two countries representing about 80% of its total volumes, and so obviously quite some disruption coming from that exposure. And similarly, the exposure that PSA has to manufacturing in countries like France and Spain has obviously a negative impact over its positioning there. What I find particularly interesting is, when you look at the results at the supplier level, there's much more variance. And that much more variance is, of course, linked to the fact that the footprint of suppliers is much more dispersed than the one of the OEMs. You have suppliers manufacturing in places where OEMs are not present. For example, the famous wiring harness production in Nicaragua or Samoan Islands and other places. So at a supplier level, we can see, of course, that the exposure that some of those South Korean manufacturers is positive. If you look at on the left-hand side of this chart, so you have SK Innovation, Hyundai, and as well as other players, Hyundai Mobis, LG Corp. One outlier at the other end is Samsung, and this is mostly related to the battery cell manufacturing that they conduct in Hungary, which is associated with pretty stringent measures from a COVID-19 lockdown perspective. So again, this is just to reinforce the fact that exposure will mean quite a lot as we look at a asymmetrical return to work in the different countries around the world. Another topic that I wanted to touch on today is launch activity. Of course, COVID-19 comes with a pretty important impact when it comes to launches for a few reasons. Of course, one, there are operational issues in pursuing the launches at this point in time. We've all been discussing supply chain disruption in various parts of the world, so it is obviously operationally not that convenient to launch a vehicle at this point in time. And of course, it is also not very justifiable in the current conditions to launch a vehicle due to the demand outlook that we can see in the markets. So some 1% of the global programs have now been impacted based on the timing adjustments that our HS Markit production forecast team has implemented. And this results in about an average of 5 months delay on average to those programs that are impacted, which is of course pretty significant impact. And as I said, in some cases it will be down to operationally inconvenient. In some cases it will be because it just doesn't make sense from a market strength standpoint to launch a vehicle at this point in time. So when we look at it from an OEM perspective, you can see, for example, that Shanghai GM Wuling is quite impacted here and is more at risk just because it has fewer nameplates. So it's obviously it's a three-party joint venture that obviously involves also GM there, and some 25% of its total number of nameplates are being up for launch in 2020. So clearly this is why you get that high level of impact, up to 6% of the total volumes combined between 2020 and 2021. On the other end, you can also see that the likes of Ford and FCA are also pretty impacted. It might not be in terms of the number of days, but certainly in terms of the size of the impact, there's a few OEMs that are at an elevated level here, particularly FCA, Ford, and GM. And if we look at Ford specifically, we're basically looking at an OEM that has some 19% of its nameplates that are up for renewal this year. So whether it is an old new nameplate, whether it is a redesign of a nameplate, but we basically have a situation whereby the old new Bronco Sport, the Mustang Mach-E, there is redesigned F-150 are scheduled for launch at a time that, as I said before, is quite inconvenient. And on the other side, you can see there GM, where we see quite a few delays of their programs, some core programs in China, as well as the delay of the Bolt EUV, which of course
then positions General Motors in not the most comfortable situation when we compare to its peers. Needless to say, the general impact through which each OEM should be seen here is one where launch curves will look completely different than anything that we were expecting before COVID-19. And this is, again, as I said, a function of the fact the OEMs will be a hostage of the supply chain disruption, supply chain availability, and of course, on the other end, also hostage of that market demand that has been waning. When we look at this exact same analysis, but from a supplier perspective, I think what's interesting here is, first to look at the fact that there are some suppliers that are significantly more impacted than others, and I would want to draw your attention to the fact that some of these suppliers, like CATL and BYD, represent to a great extent a pure play into the EV space. So what does this mean? This means effectively that there's quite a few delays to EV launches, and of course, if you are a battery cell manufacturer, clearly this is a pretty disruptive situation. So specifically, if we want to mention a couple of these that of course result in an impact for CATL, I will mention some delays on VW's ED series models, and some of the delays that we have seen for EV startups particularly in China. So definitely quite some variance there in the results. Now, when we look at it in terms of overall impact of these launch delays, for some suppliers, this results in quite a substantial revenue hit to the tune of 560 million in the case of Bosch, and if you look at the top 50 suppliers, we're looking at about $100 million, and this is purely out of the adjustments in launch activity that we have recorded over the last couple of weeks. So clearly, launches activities combined, delays to the launches activities combined to that weaker demand outlook will have a pretty substantial impact on the supplier's revenue generation capability. Finally, I wanted also to, in this quick overview on some of the key trends that we are seeing before from a manufacturing disruption standpoint, then moving on to launch activity, and then finally on to regulation. I mentioned just before EVs, and clearly EVs are impacted, as we have seen before from those delays. Of course, regulation plays a big part into that whole EV deployment schedule. So we run a survey with our clients, and obviously this has been a survey that's really been targeted at the largest suppliers as well as the OEMs. We had 140 respondents back in April, at the beginning of April, and one of the questions we asked was really about the regulatory environment. How do OEMs and suppliers expect this regulatory environment to change? And we've asked that in different areas of regulatory environment, whether it was mobility as a service or, for example, CO2/fuel economy, or whether it was autonomy. And one thing that was quite, I would say, astounding to an extent is that 98% of respondents pretty much indicated that there would have been some form of impact to fuel economy and or CO2, depending on which country you're asking regulation. This is, of course, in a way it's expected. Perhaps it's not too expected that the number is so high, and clearly that uncertainty on the regulatory environment remains pretty high in this post-COVID or in phase 2 COVID management phase. Particularly the respondents have been highlighting the fact that they expect regulation on fuel economy and CO2 in Europe to be watered down over the next couple of years. And we do see, of course, that there are some immediate milestones that the European Commission might have to go through in the coming months to possibly retailor some of that regulation, which could in some way negatively impact EVs. I mean, the jury is still out there with regards to what the potential measures could be for scrappage schemes, for example, or for even CO2 regulation and how fines will be calculated for the OEMs. But generally speaking, there is quite a substantial impact expected here by OEMs and suppliers, and that might not materialize fundamentally at the end of the day. So I would say, generally speaking, here we can see that COVID-19 is of course impacting not just the operational aspects of how the OEMs get their job done in terms of delivering cars to dealerships as well as manufacturing operations, but we also see impacts in how they are effectively planning the new technology deployment, not just with regards to EV technology, but also with regards to autonomous vehicles and so on. For the exact same question on autonomous vehicles, we had about 60% of respondents saying that there would be also an impact. And again, this is something that naturally makes quite a lot of sense. In this day and age, it would be very difficult to have regulation that forces significant add-on costs that either a final consumer or an OEM would have to pay for, and so fundamentally you can understand why this would result in respondents indicating that some delay or some watering down of regulation is somewhat expected. So just to close on this now, and then we have further presentations and Q&A. So it's pretty clear that we're going into this world of asymmetry, and keeping track how that asymmetry is going to develop over the next few weeks and months is fundamental to really understand, where there is a fundamental weakness of demand, or whether there is potentially a certain resurgence of demand in various parts of the world. We definitely see supply chain risk and disruption risk heightened for the foreseeable future, given that many OEMs and suppliers have now gone through several weeks of shutdown, and inevitably will take a fair amount of time to have that reestablished. If you look at our forecasts, of course, the risk is definitely on the downside. There's a lot of uncertainty, and clearly, we are trying to do the best we can to be on top of this, but we really need to look at how that pandemic will develop, and also what sort of policies the various governments are putting in place to manage that. And then finally, delays around e-mobility and autonomy are expected to a different extent, and with some regional variances, some OEM variances. So there's quite a few factors to be considered there, but we're definitely on top of a new set of challenges for the industry, and this will inevitably result in a readjustment of what the technology deployment strategies the OEMs will be pursuing. So yeah, that was just my overview, and yeah, I'm keen to address any questions in the upcoming Q&A. Back to you, Christopher.
Fantastic, Matteo. Thank you so much for that great insight and presentation. And we'll have Matteo back, of course, for the Q&A. But I'm very pleased that I can introduce our next panelist, Fathi Tlatli from DHL. Fathi, I can see that you're already there, so trust you can hear me, and I can extend my virtual handshake to you and welcome you to our panel.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Ludwig. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the last weeks, if not months, we've seen an unprecedented supply chain disruption. For example, we've seen shrinking air freight and ocean freight capacity, where up to 83% of the passenger belly capacity has been lost. We've seen also a race for capacity, mainly out of China, and with a lot of medical cargo prioritized. And we've seen also an increasing blank sailing on ocean freight. Also, something important that we've seen, a lot of borders started to close. So in terms of border crossing, while borders remain widely open for cargo, it's not necessarily the case for people and logistics workers. There are also quarantine rules in ports and airports that make the cross-border trade much more difficult. In addition, we can see that temporary labor coming from abroad starts to be less and less available, which is especially impacting some Western European Union countries. So something else that we see, it's a congested logistics infrastructure. One indicator of some of the challenges we have is an increase of 54% of e-commerce orders in Q1 and certainly the last weeks. So that means that logistics is impacted by crisis and peak demand in some areas, and of course we see lower demand in other areas. We also see backlogs in hubs and ports, and that's mainly now with China coming back on track. We see definitely that. Eventually, we see quite a lot of planned shutdowns. While China is reopening now in most of its plants, we see them closing in the US. Still, a lot of them are closed in Europe, although they start to come back. So next topic is the impact we see in terms of the forwarding industry. There, if we talk about ocean freight in fact is not fully disrupted at the moment, but there are restrictions, of course, on crew change. In some countries, the crews, cannot leave the vessel. We see that in the US. And then there are additional documentation and health screenings that are required as well. Port congestion can really complicate logistics. However, although the global trade volumes are down by approximately 30% in April-May, ocean carriers have implemented an unprecedented sailing schedule. So far, we do not see, however, extraordinary congestion to be reported anywhere. But so far, the situation is challenging and manageable. But who knows, what the future will bring, especially with the blank sailings. In terms of air freight, the global air cargo capacity is around 35% below 2019 levels. And it's, of course, driven by the significant reduction of the belly capacity, although the freighter capacity increased by 20% compared to 2019. We, of course, see an incredible race for capacity because, of course, the automotive industry is not alone looking for capacity. So it is important to now, we're in the phase where we are, to prepare the restart of the different activities and coping with the uncertainty. So what we can see, the first priority in general for us, as well as for the OEMs, tier 1s, tier 2s, is to reboot the global automobility supply chains. So the idea is to coordinate supplier rebound ahead of vehicle assembly in several plants, or at least while people are working on reduced shifts. We see also programs in order to reposition the vessels and the truck fleets, as well as the equipment for a phased restart, and that requires proactivity and proper planning, as well as adapting the production planning to logistics and plant safety constraints, because there are safety constraints that are definitely reducing the productivity on both sides, on the plant sides, on the production side, but also on the warehousing side and transportation side. So in fact, we are in a situation where a phased restart is to be expected across countries. It was in a way easier to get the entire world into lockdown that took a few weeks, but getting the entire world back to normal may take 4 to 6 months and potentially more until a vaccine is found. That means that it's important also to redesign a transitory setup matching new constraints by evaluating the mid-crisis impact on supply and demand. We've seen some programs of direct to dealers on a temporary basis in order to make sure that there is no idle capacity at the moment. Therefore, it is important to adapt current logistics setups to minimize cost and guarantee service. Important is to design efficient logistics processes that are compliant with the COVID-19 safety measures, which is really key. And we've seen here situations that we had seen before when with the SARS crisis, and where there were procedures that are re-emerging now. So of course we learned from that, and it helps now going forward implementing these measures. Eventually, in such a difficult environment, it is important to demonstrate agility with supply chain partners. And as the global full restart will be a matter of months, it will require adaptability. We will see supplier challenges and failures, and we will see structural impacts. We've heard that from the previous presentation on the way forward. So it is important to take that into consideration when we develop the reboot strategies and activities. Now, while globalization will last, and because we will still live in a global world, and why will we still live in a global world? Because the world is increasingly digitalized. And so the more it gets digital, the more it gets connected, the more this world shrinks and gets global. However, I would say that the world's risky dependence on vulnerable nodes in our global supply chains could lead to some production and sourcing moving closer to end users. And actually, that's a trend we start to see also pre-COVID-19, and that may be further enhanced, where we see more production closer to the regions, if not the countries. What also is important is to more than ever assess supply risks, redesign supply chain, and increase data sharing and visibility. Visibility is a key word if we want to be not just reactive, but also proactive in what we do, and also take the contingency measures early enough. So we will also see a diversification of the supply chains out of more countries, a trend that we had before, and that means that the logistics providers will need to invest in new geographies and new areas and increase their investments. Important also in such a situation is to limit the capital expenditures and to find synergies with more agile production and distribution. here we also will see an increase, and we start to see that, of knockdown assembly programs, where with the more agile and less asset incentive production strategies, where all parts required for assembly are centralized and shipped in kits. So that means that there are less line stoppages because of one component missing, as you know, we have a single sourcing for the kits. And with electrification, we will see more of that. And of course, we all work on the logistics related to that, including the packaging elements related to that. Another trend that started prior to COVID-19 and may increase is the shared distribution. That, of course, will limit costs and ensure service in lower demand context. Another element is, of course, to leverage technologies and innovation. IoT and robotics application pilots now will be implemented. Some of these applications are, for example, robots. We talked a lot about robots, but now we will see more of some kind of robots, like the disinfection cleaning robots. We will see more of that in the warehouses, and also close to the production facilities. We will see more AGV, driverless vehicles that, in a way, will be safer, because, of course, you won't have people necessarily touching them several times. Digitalization will be there and will be the norm going forward, and of course all the security related to it. Other activities that we start to see even more, they looked more visionary, is, for example, 3D printing and other activities that we will see more in our environment. And eventually, it's definitely the right time to develop the new mobility supply chains. We will see a surge of electric vehicle logistics requirements in terms of battery logistics, of course, related to the electrification, based not everywhere, but based on some incentive schemes that we will see more in some European countries. It can be China, France, and other ones. We will also have to work more in terms of the logistics related to fleets and leasing, where we will see more leasing of used cars. And we will have to address more and more the automobility e-commerce activities, because e-commerce, we have billions of activities of e-commerce for aftermarket, in terms of accessories, in terms of tires, in terms of lighting, filters, and this will be on the rise. We also can anticipate that we will see more ordering and configuration of cars on the internet, and that means also all the logistics associated to that. So this is something important. Eventually, in such a world, it will be key to build more resilient supply chains and reduce complexity in these supply chains. Therefore, it is the right time to invest in risk management. Risk management helps really to visualize potential risks, but of course the situation online, because in a certainly increasingly volatile and dynamic environment where visibility and early data leverage is key to make a difference and to mitigate the different risks of the supply chains. And of course, the recent events have been analyzed not only in terms of logistics activities, but also in terms of potential risk related to some suppliers not able to deliver, or sometimes missing documentation. So we will see some alternative supply chain activities, and the likes of us and other ones are offering to their customers what we will call resource centers for supply chain updates, where people, get reports and get informed about these kind of incidents, where information, communication really make a difference. So we are in a world where it's more and more important to communicate, of course, to have a focus on the operations, but still having a view on what will go forward, what will happen forward, in order to be able to address that not only reactively but proactively. And this is my input for the presentation today.
Fantastic. Fathi, thank you so much for that. I think we got some really tremendous insight there into what we see happening, obviously currently in logistics networks, which are, as you mentioned, highly disrupted in a number of areas, albeit starting to get back online and move through. Freight was never technically shut down, but nonetheless, clearly the boundaries have been thickened. And I think you pointed at some really interesting areas which are changing or likely to change, be it in the regionalization, be it investments in auto, in new mobility. You know, I'd like to invite Matteo back onto the panel. Hi, Matteo, nice to see you. You know, I want to open this up basically for Q&A for our panel. We already have a bunch that have flown in, but just before I kind of put those questions, let's do another poll, because actually you both raised some issues which we thought we can just get a quick impact from the audience on. And one of them was something with Fathi referred to in terms of regionalization, nearshoring, localization to build resilient supply chain. So I just wanted to get a feel for what our audience might think of how that might develop. And so the poll will be launched momentarily, and you should be able to start voting now. How will the crisis impact regionalization, nearshoring of the automotive supply chain? Do you think it will accelerate nearshoring? Do you think it will have no impact on nearshoring, or will it in fact decelerate nearshoring, which we've certainly already seen? So a quick vote here, and I can see the numbers are climbing, and it's going to be pretty overwhelming. I won't reveal until the final moment, just giving another 10 seconds. I think, you know, it's worth pointing out that there was quite a regionalization trend leading into the crisis, which we've noted over the last 5 years coming out of, in fact, the financial crisis. And so some points of which that could continue, and that is very much what our audience sees happening. So I'll just kind of share that with you, because it's 82% expect an acceleration. So hopefully you could see that. Sorry if you couldn't. There we go. So 82% overwhelmingly see the shift there happening. So quite interesting there. Obviously, our audience is kind of in agreement about how that's likely to develop. I thought, you know, one thing, just to turn to you first, Matteo, as a question. So clearly, we're talking about a highly volatile period that we're in and likely to face. We've seen a couple of examples of OEMs who have restarted and you know, perhaps run into some issues, others which are continue to run smoothly. Do you anticipate a kind of series of starts and stops, if you like, over the coming months? Is that kind of inevitable in this process? And is that a cost risk? I mean, is it sort of inefficient and unhealthy, if you like, for these plants to have to turn off and on again in that way, or is that just kind of part of the new normal?
Right. Yeah, I would say that it's definitely part of the new normal. You have a situation whereby inevitably that whole funnel of parts that had to be delivered have been effectively shut down for several weeks now, and inevitably the longer that has been shut down, you know, the longer it will take for it to go back up to a level that was pre-crisis now. And I'm just talking about, you know, purely from an operational standpoint. So I would definitely expect more start and stop situations. And as I was alluding in my presentation, you know, OEMs will be hostages to supply chain disruption. And given the asymmetry we'll see in the various regions, you know, it was quite interesting that you know, we were you know, full of questions from Chinese OEMs wondering about whether they will get their bearings or specialty steel that they tend to source from Europe and some parts of North America, or even wiring harnesses from Mexico, right? And so this tells you the level of challenges that the industry faces. And not only that, even when they say, well, we have restarted, I mean, I like to refer to this as, one thing is to have your lights on, right? And the other thing is to start actually churning cars on your parking lot. So there's a big difference. We've seen in Wuhan, this was definitely the case. We might have heard, and we conducted quite a few surveys with about 400 suppliers in China, and we tried to get information at the plant level about what their theoretical capacity was. And what you noticed was definitely that there was I would say some level of separation between theory and practice, where some companies thought that they could reach 75% of capacity utilization, when in reality they actually couldn't because of either upstream parts missing or because of labor shortages. So it's definitely unfortunately a start and stop scenario.
Absolutely. I think that echoes the conversations I've been having with OEMs and tier suppliers. It's a daily process for OEMs today to keep in contact with suppliers and logistics providers to check their deliverability, if they're able to deliver. But it's worth pointing out that an OEM like Volkswagen has 40,000 suppliers, and so and they're not always a direct line to each of them, and it only takes one, doesn't it, for this to interrupt. Fathi, from you obviously outlined some of the logistics issues that we're clearly facing, which we're increasingly familiar with in our own lives to some extent, whether we're trying to order things online, and certainly we see that we'll see that strongly in the supply chain. Do you think the logistics network is in and of itself likely to be a big risk factor in some of this start and stop as we go forward, or do you think there's enough, if you like, robustness in the chain? I have in mind in particular the fact that some of the usual alternative routes like air freight, kind of express on passenger flights might be more limited or remain more limited than perhaps in the past.
First of all, I was interested in the poll related to nearshoring, and there was a small percentage still thinking that there will be not necessarily nearshoring. So that illustrates also the diversity of the supply chains in this world. So it's not one size fits it all. So it means that we will see nearshoring in several activities, but there are some activities that will stay global, right? So, and of course that has implication on the supply chains. Now, in terms of the logistics networks, in the middle of this crisis, that was completely unforeseen at the beginning, I would say, and at least the complexity of the situation was unforeseen. So there, the logistics operators were still, in activity, and they were still, operating. So what I will see, and they were creative, and they are creative. For example, because of the decrease of the air freight capacity, they even put, scheduled charters, and we see quite a lot of these, especially that, there are a lot of aircraft that are still, available and that can be potentially transformed into cargo aircraft. So also we see on the ocean freight, we've seen a situation that is not chaotic at the moment. So what we will see, I think that it will be more or less sustainable. We will see bottlenecks, and what we will see, and mostly because also of the safety measures, and that of course that are necessary, but that decrease productivity at the different levels of the supply chain logistics. So there we will see some delays. So it means that we may not have the usual speed, but maybe we may not need the same speed now that we won't be running at full production, that the consumers won't be, consuming all kind of goods the same way they did it before, at least as fast as we thought, and that e-commerce will come back to a certain more normal situation when all the shops will be open. So I think that we will see bottlenecks, we will see delays. In some situations, like with the express networks, we may not be offered the usual 24 hours or 30 hours. Maybe on some destination it may last a little bit more. But the industry has shown resilience, creativity, and I talk really for all kinds of players there. and I think that it should be okay. I mean, not perfect certainly, but it should be fine.
Yeah, I think the the resilience of some of the logistics providers does continue to show through. We've seen in Europe a lot of quick reactions, even in niche areas like outbound logistics, where providers are kind of taking the furloughing measures that they need to take, but getting ready and by and large able to weather right now. So, but I think the test is yet to come for automotive, and that's what we're clearly going to see over the next couple of weeks as we kind of ramp up. But thanks for the input. Lots of questions from the audience, so I try to group a little bit where I can, just to kind of cover things. And we've had a few questions, if you like, which Matteo, I suppose trying to drill down or get some sense about some specific OEMs, which you may not be able to go into lots of detail about specifics, but in your index, you obviously were showing where some sat in terms of their levels of disruption. And there was in particular some questions about where BMW sat in there, as well as where Jaguar Land Rover, more specifically whether Jaguar Land Rover was included in Tata, in how that was measured. So maybe just a little bit of where perhaps those car makers, or perhaps car makers like them, in that case premium Europeans if you like, sit in terms of the disruption index there.
Right, sure. So with regards to first to answer the easy one, which is where JLR is, yes, it's categorized together with Tata in that specific visualization. Yeah, so in terms of BMW, our first thing to say is that from a launch activity so far, we're not seeing a huge disruption there, and of course, if you really need to look at the exposure that this manufacturer has. So you have obviously a level of US exposure, you have a strong European and centrally German exposure, and then China. So it is better positioned than others for sure, and specifically, when you compare an FCA to perhaps Jaguar Land Rover, or compare BMW, sorry, to Jaguar and Land Rover, as well as, for example, the likes of some near premium brands like, from the PSA group, for example. There's definitely a privileged position there. It goes without saying that this is not to say that they are also exposed to the same issues that any manufacturer is exposed to, which is effectively demand collapsing in all of the core markets, with some of the big five in Europe that are recording drops anywhere between 80 to 90+% this month. So clearly it's gonna hurt for BMW too.
Absolutely. And then there was another kind of question specific. I believe this was referring to the slide around the vehicle programs and the delays to that. And then there was actually a remark that 1%, or the 1 point something percent, I think, which was quoted there, seemed quite low. But is that sort of in a global context, or is that kind of what you can see so far in terms of what's been announced, which is partly why we see China higher, even though China is actually getting back up faster, if that makes sense?
Right. Yeah. So the 1% is calculated as a percentage of the total programs deployed in each global plant, right? So you're obviously talking quite a significant amount of programs there, and those programs that are already in place are largely unimpacted by, of course, delays, because they're not going through any form of launch. And we're not considering specifically facelifts in there. We're looking only at some of the major redesigns, all new vehicles, or vehicles that are exposed to a new platform, underpinned by a new platform. And so far it's 1.3% of the total global tally of the vehicles that are produced on a global basis. But actually, if you start looking at it in relative terms of what had to be launched, or to what we would expect being launched in 2020, the number is significantly higher. So yeah, it's 1% of the global universe, so it looks low, but it's still a significant amount. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the 560 million impact to Bosch, right? Which in the grand scheme of things is a big deal.
Absolutely. So again, a number of other questions have sort of flooded in. And Fathi, I might start with you on this one. I've had quite a few questions, and this is a rolling theme throughout most of the sessions that we've done. People are very keen to understand if they think that in this next phase of the crisis or post-crisis, there will be some changes to just-in-time measurements, to inventory levels, to how these sort of more traditional, these very classic automotive processes from a manufacturing and delivery point of view go. Maybe I might start with you just to take your view from DHL.
Yeah. So what do we see if we take the tier ones or tier twos as well as the OEMs who have contingency plans and that's really a coordinated structure globally and you know quite a collaborative way of operating. We tend to see less disruptions in the activities, yeah, and much more collaboration in the approach, and let's say trust is the key there. So maybe if beyond, you know, the tools or whatever, what is important is really to have this level of trust and this level of cooperation, because then together you can, you know, go the extra mile, because we are in situations where, you know, we all need to go the extra mile, and we need to go out of our comfort zone. So we see ones that realize that they are in a kind of crisis mode, in a different mode, and that adapt slightly some of their process or whatever, and are clear in terms of their priorities, in terms of their KPIs, and then share this with their suppliers, which help them, you know, working together around this KPI. So that's the ones I would say who will communicate more, who will be more proactive in their approach, would be, and the ones that work more on a trust basis would be the ones eventually that would be less impact than we've seen that. I mean, and the ones also that can go a little bit off track, because, you know, there are some processes, it can be some usual classical sourcing process or whatever, that you need to slightly adapt in such a current environment, right? So once, you know, you take that into consideration, then I would say the impact is still there. Of course, we cannot hide that we are in a complicated environment, but still it can be mitigated. Also, what helps is that for automotive, we have a kind of progressive ramp up. So and that's why something interesting, we've seen an increase, for example, of an ocean freight activities the last month and weeks. So it means that, you know, we had some of our customers that, you know, started to prepare the next phase, and of course using ocean freight in these situations, of course, helps you of course to slowly prepare yourself to have inventory on the ocean. Then, and of course, you have the urgent situation where you still need to use air freight. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Did you want to add anything that Matteo from your side?
I would say, obviously, you know, Fathi is our logistics expert on the panel today. But yeah, I would say that you know, there's obviously, you know, we have to go through quite a few weeks of really understand what works, and you know, specifically with regards to you know, we've all heard the stories, and you know, I'm sure Fathi has quite a few anecdotes that that are interesting over the last 13, 14 weeks, right? Of you know, the sort of measures that the OEMs have been taking just to get that production back up. And you know, I think, you know, the industry has definitely shown how inventive it is with regards to getting that product out of the door. But at the same time, you know, there's no contingency plan that can weather such level of measures that we are seeing implemented on a global basis now. So, you know, regardless, you know, I recall the nearshoring question, or also, you know, question on whether, you know, we do more just in time and so on. You know, it's pretty clear that we're going through, you know,
I call it a generational crisis, right? So it's unheard of, and you know, I don't think that if we had done much more homework, we would have probably been able to keep those factories open anyway.
Yeah, just one element I would say, I would add also, there is an area which is also the road freight activities. This area may see some impacts at one point in time when, you know, in some parts of the world like Europe, when, you know, we will have really activities at a higher speed and going to a more normal level with maybe not only one shift, but the second shift. There, we need to see whether the borders can be open again for foreign workforce, you know, to work there, because then we may have a shortage of drivers and these kind of things. Plus, it is important that also when you outsource, you know, some of these road freight activities, that, you know, some smaller companies are still operational in the right way. So there, of course, there will be definitely some challenges also to overcome, like all the other challenges, and that's where, you know, really it's important really to work together on the solutions.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate, and I think the questions around lean and nearshoring often come up. And what's interesting is that it's potentially a contradiction, right? Because if you source more locally, you tend to have lower inventory, because that's part of the benefit of sourcing locally. So you'd probably have more just in time in some instances compared to if you're, you know, bringing more in from further away. So I kind of get that point there too that Matteo raised. You know, I short of kind of having had a lot of test kits ready to go and everything like that, I'm not 100% sure how some of this could have been avoided. But nonetheless, it provokes a lot of change in the way. And I think another topic which is coming up a lot in our questions, which partly relates, but is I think from a different side. I'll address it from 2 points, because one is kind of logistics and one is broader purchasing. And it's around whether, you know, in the wake of the crisis, there'll be a lot more focus on kind of low supply costs, low supplier costs and rates, and kind of pushing those down as much as possible. And if that will, you know, kind of bring other fragility, or there'll be maybe a look to be a bit more holistic, not to just go for the lowest cost, and to kind of include a wider picture. So, and that question then also went specifically, Fathi, and I'll leave that for you, to logistics carriers as well, logistics rates. You know, will there just be a push to drive the rates so low, or will there be a kind of broader understanding? This is, you know, good luck kind of predicting the activities of purchasing, I suppose. But Matteo, do you think, is that already is that a fair assessment of what kind of happens in the purchasing process for suppliers in terms of, you know, lowest cost always wins? And if either way, how does, you know, any aspect of that do you anticipate to change, or as we go out into the next phase of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to demystify a bit how contracts are assigned to suppliers in tenders. So the company with the lowest net present value tends to win the tender. No, that's kind of the, you know, when you issue an RFQ, you know, you put in your offers, and whoever comes up with of course, provided that, you know, the level of quality is at the right level, there's no history of any sort of financial risk or quality risk and so on, lowest NPV wins. Now that equation is not going to change because of COVID, and that financial pressure that the OEMs will have to go through will probably be heightened as a function of COVID. And of course, you know, there's going to be pressure on finding ways to achieve higher purchasing efficiencies. I mean, this is quite natural in the context of the OEMs trying to preserve some level of profitability, both in premium manufacturers and volume manufacturers too. So yeah, so I expect, of course, you know, heightened pressure on suppliers' margins. And I mean, to be completely honest, whilst of course suppliers do have a propensity to complain about, you know, the level of pressure that they're under from the OEMs,
You just need to look at the average profitability that larger suppliers declare versus the OEMs, and often cases you'll find that is actually higher than the OEMs, which has been sometimes a point of contention in the past. And so yeah, most likely we'll have a situation whereby there will be more demands for concessions, and those concessions can be done in several ways. It could be down to payment terms. It could be down to increased pressure on what they call the productivity savings. In other words, the year-on-year efficiency gain that each supplier has to deliver to the OEM, which in the case of a Volkswagen could be anywhere between 3 to 5%. For other OEMs, it could be lower. So there's quite a few avenues that they could take this, but to be completely honest, they have to be very careful how they also do that, because we have quite a few situations where financial distress among suppliers will begin to emerge following COVID, or let's say following this phase 2 of COVID, and so they have to play it very carefully.
Yeah, I would say that more than ever, for suppliers, it is key to be highly relevant, to deliver really key value and understand, the shared value you are delivering, and also try to improve optimize the overall cost and the cost of doing business. Yeah, so that's really important, because we may have situations where people said, and we had very little situations like that, where they'll say, oh yeah, we need X% decrease in rates, and of course when you lose at overnight 80% of the capacity, you are not really in such a scenario, you are in a bottleneck. But then you need to consider that, because of course you understand that the people you are dealing with have their issues. So in such a situation, more than ever, you need to look at ways to be more creative in the way you can optimize these costs, and you find supply chain efficiencies, and then that can eventually equal to a price reduction that sometimes you cannot offer just because the costs have increased tremendously.
Absolutely. Thanks both for that. Maybe the last point, because there's a few questions on that, and you both raised it from different sides in a way, was I guess what we might expect in the next stage of the electric vehicle supply chain investment and development. And I thought, Matteo, you obviously raised the regulatory potential from what we're hearing about, that there might be some delays to how this is applied, which is of course a big driving factor in some of the investment we were seeing, certainly in Europe and in China. And on the other hand, it was interesting, kind of thinking about where those suppliers might be more resilient in the kind of process too, in terms of localizing that. And Fathi, you raised it as this is a good time to indeed invest in a kind of new mobility supply chain for EV. So, I mean, this year's a hit. There's no question about that. But generally speaking, where's your feeling? Will the kind of rate of investment that we were seeing, for example, in Europe, where we have 30 or so gigafactories which are kind of slated to come online maybe in the next 5 years or so, like that. Do you think in the end, once we start moving past the strict restrictions, we get something like back on track for that, or are we likely to see that prolonged? And then maybe Fathi, you can comment from why you think it's such a good time from a logistics provider's point of view to invest in that supply chain.
Yeah, I would say, first let's look at the amount of investment. So we have to separate between what is a short-term impact to what is a long-term trend. Short-term impact, yes, there are delays. Is it a good time to launch an EV when dealership are shut down? Obviously the answer is quite obvious. But we need to look at how much capital has been invested in those electric vehicles. We estimate about 300 billion have been put on the plate for electrification development, and only about, inverted commas, only about 100 billion for autonomous vehicles,
whether it is sensors or mobility startup and so on. So that capital is so significant that it's very difficult for the OEMs just to effectively, just have spent it without any form of return on that quite significant capital investment. So those investments are locked in. Delays will happen, and of course the long-term trend is that we have a higher percentage of electrification. We can discuss percentages, we can discuss what that curve looks like, but the direction is pretty clear, so that's definitely not going to change. If you were asking on whether we're going to see some other technologies impacted, where they might actually not either not see the light or see the light perhaps in 10 years down the line, well, probably if you look at some of those autonomous vehicle technologies that sometimes are enabling business models around mobility, those will be much more severely impacted, and you start seeing announcements from Audi, delaying level 3 vehicles and others. So, but for electrification, it's just a delay from the way we see it. It's not a fundamental rethink of priorities.
Interesting. Okay, absolutely. And Fathi, would you add anything to that? Again, having highlighted this as a good time, or in the recovery phase, a good time for logistics providers to invest in that.
So in fact, we are living, of course, in a society, and we will see an increasing concern towards safety, and we see already discussions about that, and it can be also safety in terms of environmental hazards. So that will be that trend will be enhanced, and even in the countries where maybe people claim, that because of the petrol price will decrease, then conventional powertrain will surge. But still, there are plenty of people who want still to use conventional powertrain, but still make sure that there are less emissions. So it can be electrification, it can be more, let's say, energy. Less energy consumption in terms of powertrain. It can be fuel cells. So that's a trend we will see in this environment that is here to last. Then what is also important is that more than 50% of the cars in a lot of countries are belonging to fleet, and big corporations like ours, for example, where we have more than 100,000 vehicles, have emission targets. Of course, so we have zero emissions target by 2050, and that you need to find ways to do it, right? And therefore, electric vehicles will be part of the equation. So, but of course, there are other means, so, and that's why we have conventional powertrains that still are there for a certain period that are important. But something else that I see here, connected to the rise of e-commerce and digitalization, it's electric vehicles have less parts, so it's easier to buy them online and to configure them online. So and that's one of the trends we see. Some of the operators in this area are less impacted at the moment because you can still order your cars online. They still can get configured in a certain way. So that's a dimension we need to take into the equation also. So I think that this is a segment that will further increase. It may be accelerated, and of course along other energy saving vehicles, and certainly also for the fleet, not only for the passenger vehicles.
Absolutely. So, well, thank you both for that. Very interesting insight. And I think in the interest of time and your time, there are loads of other questions. Perhaps we can collect them together and come up with a way that we can get some of them answered in a bit of a follow-up where we can release that. But I want to thank Matteo and Fathi for the presentations. I think full of rich of insight and lots of key stuff to take away. For those attending, we will include the video of this recording and the slides. We'll make these available. You'll receive them by email, and they'll be on our website as well. So we'll be sharing those. And I want to just, before I sort of close, thank you again, Matteo, and thank you, Fathi, for all of your time and input. That was really, really fascinating from my side.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks again, Jonathan. Thank
you.
you. Thank you. So everyone, thanks again for continuing to join us in this series as we continue to kind of bring and share insight with you during this time of crisis. A couple of points just before I close. I usually like to provide you with some further reading, just to kind of highlight some of the new editions out on our current platforms. We'll send you links on those as well. If you could, you'll see we have our latest issue of Automotive Manufacturing. We've recently released a new forecast in our the ECG Business Intelligence unit, of which we partner, which will provide you some European insight. There'll be a link we'll provide you to this. It's on our website, on ECG's website, and we've also just launched our new digital edition of Automotive Logistics. Again, everything digital, and you know, keeping the insight coming and sharing with you, even at this time when even our own supply chains are disrupted in terms of reaching you via events or print. You're going to continue to find us here every week as part of our ongoing Automotive Festival of Transformation. You can see we've got a couple of things already lined up. There'll be some other key things coming down the line, but next week we have a plan. We're going to be focusing more on tier suppliers, specifically some of the issues facing there. So that'll be an interesting session. We're going to be turning to Mexico, where we've identified as a risk area for the automotive supply chain for now, but clearly a critical part of the North American picture, and of course quite interesting with the USMCA dates being recently now announced. July 1st will be coming into force, so a lot of stuff having to happen in parallel to the crisis. We're also going to have some closer looks at aftermarket as an area of the supply chain which keeps on going. And we'll have another kind of bigger update towards the end of next month. This is not the only bit that you'll be hearing from us. We have other live streams planned, so do continue to get in touch. If you have ideas or if you want to get involved, reach out to me, reach out to my colleague, find us on the website, and please, you know, bring us your ideas, because it's all about you, it's all about the industry, and we keep moving into the next and ongoing phases of this. And I'm sort of, you know, glad to see that things continue to evolve. Nothing is back to normal. We're very, very far from anything like normal. One of the questions which we didn't get to was, what's the new normal look like? Well, that's part of what this whole series is about, investigating all of the new processes and areas that we need to address to stay safe, to get back, but still obey the right guidelines. So thanks for all of your time. You know, these are extended sessions on the once a month basis, but I hope you enjoyed the insight. We enjoyed having you, and look forward to seeing most of you back here again next week for the live stream hour. Thanks again. Stay safe and stay well.